Well, hello and welcome to our Maundy Thursday service. It might be that you've not been to a Maundy Thursday service before. Well, let me explain a little bit about what's going to happen. Maundy Thursday is the day Christians remember what happened to Jesus the day before Good Friday. The day began with preparations for the Jewish Passover commemorations. Jesus was Jewish, and he celebrated their special days. And Passover was the time that Jewish people did and still do remember the rescue that God gave them from their captivity in Egypt. They were being held there as a slave labor force. So on Maundy Thursday, Jesus asked his disciples, the 12, to go and prepare a Passover meal for them in an upper room. And that's what they did. They prepared it for Jesus and the 12 of them. The 13 of them went into the room, they went upstairs, and they had a traditional Passover meal together. And that's what we now know as the Last Supper. And then, after they'd finished eating, Jesus led them to a garden called Gethsemane, which was and still is there on the side of the Mount of Olives, overlooking Jerusalem in Israel. And there he prayed. And he prayed. And he prayed. Knowing full well what was going to happen to him the very next day, that first Good Friday. We'll come back to the garden a little bit later on in our time together. But first, I'd like us to wind back a chapter in Philippians. We're in Philippians on Sundays. We're going to wind back a chapter in Philippians and consider what it was that Jesus did. What he did to be anywhere near that Passover meal and that garden on that night. Well, let's pick up at Philippians chapter 2 and verse 6. Let me read it for us. Jesus, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself. Let's think about that for a moment, shall we? Who is Jesus? Well, Paul tells us there, doesn't he, that he's in very nature God. He's God the Son, the second person of the Trinity. He was God the Son when he asked the disciples to prepare that room for him. He was God the Son when he shared that last meal with his friends. He was God the Son when he went to the garden on the Mount of Olives. And he could have used that status, the status of being God, to his own advantage, couldn't he? To get out of a spot of bother, wouldn't you? Well, I think I would. But not Jesus. Rather, Jesus made himself, willingly, knowingly, made himself nothing. Think about that. God made himself nothing. At his hour of greatest vulnerability, facing the last 24 hours of his earthly life, Jesus chose to continue being nothing. Well, nothing in terms of status, anyway. He chose to be a servant who humbled himself, made himself the lowest of the low. The top-ranking person to ever have walked the earth took on the position of being the lowest ranking. It's remarkable, isn't it? The lowliest of the low. He, being in very nature God, chose that. Intentionally, deliberately, he chose to be nothing. But even though he chose humble lowliness in status, he remained everything in significance. Significant, yes, because his servanthood took him to the cross. He humbled himself to become nothing and chose death, even death on a cross. His servanthood meant for him to die the death of a criminal. And the thing about that, we'll find out more tomorrow. But today, I want us to get what it meant for Jesus, the divine Son of God, to humble himself like that. Why not spend the next few moments listening to the piece of music we've got lined up for you in the next clip, listening to that music and considering what it meant for Jesus to humble himself to the status of the lowest of the low, for God the Son to come to the world and choose nothingness, lowliness, humility over status.